Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. If you've seen my videos before, welcome back. Please consider subscribing to my channel on YouTube and hit that notification bell so you'll be informed whenever I post a new video. For your convenience, you can download any of my videos to your desktop via my website, and the address is above. Can I also encourage you to take a look at my image galleries on Flickr? If I can't inspire you just a little bit there, then I'm not likely to be able to do that with this video. I'll add a link below. I've made a few videos recently on my experiences switching from a Canon full-frame SLR to the new mirrorless Canon R5. Now those experiences have been pretty good, I have to say, and my confidence with birds in flight, at least with the larger birds, is as high as ever. I'll link to a couple of those videos below. In this video, I thought it may be interesting to process one of these images through Adobe Camera Raw. The image was shot using the electronic shutter with the Canon R5, but probably the most important issue is that I was trying a much higher ISO of 2500. I wanted to get a feel for the amount of noise these higher ISO settings would generate. To be honest, the lighting conditions at the time didn't really warrant an ISO of 2500, but the object of the exercise here was to see the results of that high ISO. So let me take you back into Photoshop's bridge just for a moment, and we'll take a look at my workflow using Adobe Camera Raw and Photoshop. Now, I don't want to repeat too much of what I said in my previous video, but these images you're viewing here, around 59 of them, are the result of one flyby of this particular bird. So the 59 images were 3 1-second bursts using the electronic shutter. As you can see, I do have an enormous number of images to choose from, all of them very similar in some respects. So what I'm going to choose is one of those down at the bottom right, where the bird was closer to me and therefore filling the frame a lot better. Now, with the image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, using either the hyperlink at the center bottom of the screen or the little cogwheel up at the top right, I've opened up my Camera Raw preferences. Of the 5 options we have on the left-hand side, it's the workflow which I just want to draw your attention to. At the top in the color space, you can see I'm using Adobe RGB, but I'm using a bit depth of 16 bits per channel, and down the bottom you can see I've got the little box ticked to open in Photoshop as a smart object. Now, in practice with this particular image, I'm not sure we're going to need the smart object status, but it's a pretty standard part of my workflow and I have that box ticked all of the time. It's very easy to remove that status in Photoshop in just a couple of clicks. So where do we start first? I think I'm going to take a look at the noise straight away. Given that this was the object of the exercise, to see just the amount of noise we could expect to get with an ISO of 2500, let's take a look. If I move on to my picture, right click and go to Zoom 2, I think we'll go up to about 200%. Now there we can see the amount of noise we're dealing with. We can see we've got a sharp shot, but we do need to deal with that noise. So let's take a look into the Detail tab over on the right hand side. Now the one or the slider that I want to go to first, and probably it's going to be the only slider, is the noise reduction. Now when I'm moving the noise reduction slider to the right, I like to keep looking at the sky because that's showing me quite a lot of the noise we have here. but I also like to keep my eye on the eye and the beak of the bird, because in dealing with the noise, what I don't want to do is to make my image cartoon-like. Now, I don't think there's any great danger with that because the noise reduction in Adobe Camera Raw is pretty good. What I also like to do is, rather than pick up the slider and move it manually and gradually, to be able to look at the effect of this slider, I like to move my cursor a fair way along, and while looking at the sky and the bird, then I click, and if you watch over on the right hand side, you'll notice that the slider jumps straight to the position of the cursor, and I can double click and reset it. So it's quite convenient to get my hand in that position and click, and I can look at the image and evaluate what it's doing, and I can remove it, and I can apply it, and I can gauge just the maximum amount of noise suppression that I'm going to put into the image without doing untold damage to the quality of the bird itself. Remember, we're looking at this at 200%. I'm going to drop this down to somewhere around 40. I can still see just a little bit of noise in the sky, but that would be pretty natural if we were looking at an image 200% enlarged. But one more try, double click, reset, bring it back. 37, I think that looks okay. I'll squeeze a bit more, but I think I'm more or less happy with the amount of noise reduction I've given here. Now, of course, we're all going to choose something slightly different. If you wanted to go a little bit higher with the noise reduction, then why not, as long as you're happy with it. Just to speed things up, I'd like to tell you that I've done some experiments with the detail and the contrast slider, and I cannot make any improvement on what I've got here. And I don't have a lot of problem with color noise, so these sliders which we can drop down here are also not having much benefit. So for the moment, and I may come back and take one last look later on, but for the moment I'm reasonably happy with what I've done. So I'm going to hit Ctrl-0 to fit the image back on screen. Now, Ctrl-0 is one of those keyboard shortcuts that is very valuable because we would be using it all the time. It works both in Adobe Camera Raw, as you've just seen, but it also works in Photoshop too. If we have an image greatly enlarged, it'll bring it back to screen size, and if we have an image very small, it'll bring it up to screen size. A good keyboard shortcut. Now, because I have a plain blue sky here, I could choose to rotate the bird just a little bit to add a nice angle to the composition. Remember, the Canon R5 captures 45 megapixels, so cropping a few pixels to accommodate a slight rotation is not going to break the bank. But in fact, we have two choices here. We can do this within Adobe Camera Raw with the crop, but if we didn't want to lose any pixels, we could do this in Photoshop and allow Content Aware Fill to help us to achieve it. Now, if time allows, we'll take a quick look at that option a little bit later. So let's go to the crop tool. I'm going to just drag in a corner of the edge of the frame, just a little bit. And when I move just outside, now I get the ability to rotate. Now, as I do, you'll notice that we cannot breach the boundaries of the image, so we are now losing some of the pixels. But it does give us the opportunity to still have a nice frame-filling shot. But now I've got a nice angle with the bird across the picture. And of course, we're all going to choose something slightly different, and we can start to move things around. And if I wanted to settle on something like that, I could just touch the Enter key. And if I wanted to use that Ctrl-0 option once again to fit the image on screen. Color balance is quite important, particularly when we're looking at blue skies like this, although this one at first glance seems to look okay. Have you noticed sometimes though, when you've done any manipulation of an image like this, or maybe even a landscape or seascape, that if we're not careful, we could lose the blue and it starts to go to a slightly different hue that looks unnatural. So I think here we need to keep the blue sky natural. Let's take a look at the color balance by going to the basic tab. I'm going to pick up the eyedropper tool from the right, and I'm just going to pick an area that's got detail, and I'm going to click in it, and I'm going to see what the effect is. Now we're bound to have some effect, and it's going to change the temperature and the tint. If we go on to the bird's head, I'm going to click just around there. Now you can see the blue has become a little more vivid, and if we look over to the temperature and tint, we can see the tint has come a little bit away from magenta. I think that's helped us a bit here, and it's taken it a little bit more towards the blue. So I think that's quite a positive change. But if you're not sure, you can always just hit Ctrl Z to undo it, or you can double click any of these and reset them. So there, I've reset them to what I had a moment ago. So let me do this once more. Either look at the screen, or if you want to see how much the temperature and tint moves, look over there now as I click. There you can see the difference, and I think I'll stay with that for the moment until I start to make changes maybe to some of the other sliders below. Now as I've come to put this video together, I was a little mistaken a few seconds ago. I thought using the eyedropper tool had moved this tint slider from the magenta end more towards the green, but in actual fact it actually did the reverse. I didn't see that because I was looking at the overall image to make my assessment. So let's move on. Now when we're shooting birds like this, we do like the sunshine to enable us to have a high shutter speed, but that same sunlight can affect the highlights at times. So let's look at the highlights and shadow sliders, starting with the highlights. I'm going to do the same as I did with the noise slider. I tend, rather than to click and drag these, to step them in one go. So I'm going to drop the highlights down quite a lot, and I'm going to step the shadows up and open up the light underneath the wings nicely there. And I'm paying attention to the blue sky to see what effect it has, and I'm quite happy so far. That's looking pretty good to me. I don't think I need to touch the blacks or the whites here, but please feel free to try them if you feel you need to. But I can see we've got quite a bit of highlight under here, and maybe a little bit around the side of the bird that we need to deal with individually in a moment. Maybe a little bit of clarity. Maybe a little touch of vibrance. That has quite an impact on the sky. This is quite common. If we push up the vibrance because we want a bit more colour on the bird, sometimes it can impact on the sky more than we would like, which is what I suggest is happening here. So what we can do then, if we are sure that we want to push the vibrance up, and on this occasion let's just assume we do, we can go to the colour mixer. If we go to the saturation and we pick up the targeted adjustment tool, if I move on to the picture, click the blue, I can just click and slide to the left, and I can return my sky to a much more natural colour. Now I'm going to go back to my basic tab for a moment, because if you look very, very closely around the bird, can you see a little bit of shading around here? The effect of the sliders that I applied seems to have added a little bit of shading. Now I've got a couple of options here. I could take off some of the highlights, and I think that's doing a pretty good job, so I think we'll stop at that point. So in making those other changes, it's forced me to return to my highlights and do a further tweak. This is all quite normal. What I'd like to do next is to take a look at the highlight on the bird just to the right of the head and the eye. To do that, I'm going to move my cursor onto the picture and click and drag to the right. Now you can see we do have tone in here, but I'm just going to bring that down a little bit by going over and selecting an adjustment brush. Coming down to my settings, I'm going to drop the highlights a little bit, the exposure just a little bit. My flow is very high, I'm going to drop that down to something like 7, 8 or 9. The feather is up fairly high, there you can see the difference between the solid part of the brush and the feather. I've got rather a large brush there, so I'll use the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P to reduce them. Still not quite happy with the flow, I'm going to drop that down to about 5. I much prefer to start with these very low and build up rather than the other way around. And I'm just going to brush along this area just to bring down the highlights a little bit and give myself a little bit more detail in those highlight areas. And as you can see, it's not taking a great deal of effort to do that. A little bit more boldness to the beat there, and I think that's pretty good. I'm going to hit Ctrl-0 to fit that on screen, but I'm going to move over to the right hand side. I'm going to select the radial filter. I'm going to go onto the picture space, click and drag. There's the shape that I'm drawing. I can change this with the toggles. I can rotate it. I can move it over my bird. Infinitely changeable this, so there's no risk. If we look over to the right hand side, I've got quite a considerable feather on the edge of this selection. Now the radial filter is already picking up some changes here, so I'm going to move into the center of that selection area, right click and reset it. Then I'm going to touch the V key to hide the selection. It's still working, it's just hidden. Now I can go to my exposure and I just want to tweak it down just a little bit. You can see what I'm doing, I'm not coming down too far. Just a little bit of vignette around the entire edge, just to make sure it's slightly darker on the outer edges than in the center. Just trying to make sure that our attention is right smack bang on the bird. To be honest, given that there's nothing else in the frame, I don't think there's a great deal of doubt about that. But we can improve matters. Subtle changes is the key. I think I'm ready to open this image up into Photoshop to complete it. I suppose there's an option where we could throw a little more light under those wings with an adjustment brush. Maybe we'll think about that. But whenever we're doing manipulation, there are times when we sometimes have to stop. Maybe we are called away. A nice thing to do sometimes is to come down to the bottom right and click Done. Everything we've done is saved in the raw file, but the image is closed down. But it does enable us to walk away. It does enable us to come back a little bit later. Sometimes there's a creative benefit to that. So let me go back into Bridge and we'll reopen it. So once we're back into Bridge, we can see the image because it's different from those around it, but even if we couldn't tell by the thumbnail, we can tell by those two little symbols at the top right. One tells us it's been cropped and in our case rotated. This one says it's been edited in Camera Raw. I can double click and it'll be opened up and we could continue with any manipulation we wanted to give. The only thing I suggested we could possibly do is to select our adjustment brush and just put a little bit more light under the wings. But to be honest, I think it looks pretty good. The only thing I would like to revisit is perhaps my radial filter. And again, these things are quite common. So let me select it. You can see the pin, but you can't see the bounding box because I'll need to go and click on the pin before we see that, because all I wanted to do was back off a little bit. To do that, I'm going to put my cursor in the little box, I'm going to use my up arrow. So I can take my cursor back to where it started and I can come down a little bit less than I did before. A nice way to fine tune. But now, if I go down to the bottom right, I can click Open Object. Remember, we're opening this as a smart object, but we don't need the smart object status. So once my image is open, I would decide if there was any further work that I needed to do in Photoshop, but I don't think there is. We can see by the thumbnail in the layers palette here, this little symbol at the bottom right tells us we're working on a smart object. We can always remove that by right-clicking just to the right of the thumbnail and rasterizing it. We're also working on a 16-bit document here. We can change that to 8-bit just to save this as a JPEG. That's how I always save my final image, as a JPEG at level 12. So I would go to Image, Mode, 8 bits per channel, and then save this to my folder in the normal way. Now, I think it's a reasonable generalization to say that with wildlife, our image editing tends to be a little more subtle than perhaps it would be with a seascape or a landscape. But here we have the finished result. Let's take a quick look at that content-aware fill if we can get through it fairly quickly. I brought you back into Bridge. I'm going to right-click the thumbnail we've been working on. I'm going to duplicate it. Then I'm going to double-click that duplicate and it'll open up into Camera Raw. If I go to my crop tool, I can hit the Escape key to remove it. So the crop that I originally placed in there and my rotation now has been removed. And I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. When the image opens up, we do have the Smart Object status back in play because we've opened this up again through Camera Raw. Control-T will bring up my free transform tool. So I can go outside of the transform tool shape, and assuming I didn't want to drag in any of the corner toggles, if I wanted to rotate the bird, you can see the effect that's going to have on the image. Now, we probably would accept a little bit of enlargement of the bird at the same time, but just to bring this video to a close, I'm going to quickly hit the tick here. Then I'm going to remove the Smart Object status, right-click and rasterize. I'm going to go to my selection tools. I'm going to select my polygonal lasso. I'm just going to do one of these. I'm going to draw a selection down there and around the top corner. If we then go to Edit, Content Aware Fill, I don't want to go into detail on what this is doing. This is the repair side. This is the side that's being repaired. We can see a perfect result here, which means I'm happy to open this up to a current layer. I don't feel the need to open it up to a different layer. I'm just going to click OK. I could do the same thing for each of the other three sides. So there's just an alternative way. We could put a rotation in the image, but we could actually fill in the sky. But it is very easy to do here, given the nature of the clear blue background. Now, with the change on screen here, you can see just what that content-aware fill is capable of. In fact, it's a lot more powerful than this. But here's my original that I think has just a little more impact. If you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.